Okay, a very pleasant good afternoon to everybody joining us, and welcome to another episode of BHBA Family Law Presents Direct Examination. I'm Dan Bemmel, financial advisor and certified divorce financial analyst. During each episode of our show, we explore our guest's personal and professional history and dig into meaningful legal topics. Today, I'm so happy to welcome back our amazing, wonderful, talented, brilliant guest host, Samantha Klein, head of the California Family Law Practice at Withers. She keeps showing up here, so we're going to keep having her on. Absolutely incredible, and we're thrilled and honored to have her here.
With that kind of introduction, I have to show up. I mean, come on.
Okay, great.
Well, really, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here for another podcast and to hear our guest today.
Yeah, it's going to be great. Before we get started, we want to announce our upcoming schedule for the first time. So please continue to join us for those new episodes, always at 12:30 p.m. live on Zoom, almost always the first Wednesday of every month. David Glass on September 6th, followed by Dennis and Laura Wasser, Rod Zuckerman, the Clemens brothers, Bruce and Keith, Judge Shelley Kaufman, Michael Trope, Kimia Klein, Adam Lipsick, and more. Sam.
Judge Silberman, welcome. Before we begin, Your Honor, we have a few housekeeping announcements. You will receive MCLE certificates shortly after the program. Please take a moment to complete the survey that is included with your certificate. The program will be available in a few days on the Beverly Hills Bar Association on-demand website. Sponsored by Beverly Hills Bar Association's newest members, presented by Lawyers Mutual Insurance Company. The family law section is also sponsored by White Zuckerman, Luna Hunt. White Zuckerman, Wachowski, Luna, and Hunt provides a wide variety of resources to complete almost any project, large and small. They also provide traditional accounting and tax practice services. We invite you to connect with them to discuss your specific accounting needs and learn how they can be of assistance.
All right, thank you. Today, we know why we're here. We're so happy to welcome Judge Harvey A. Silberman. As everybody watching must know, he's one of the longest tenured family law judges on the bench, currently sitting in Department L in Pasadena. Judge Silberman has been in family law, well, really since before his first election in 2008, and with a long and diverse career prior to taking the bench, Judge Silberman brings a very unique perspective, which I know we're going to explore today. He's been a recipient of just about every Judge of the Year award that I can find out there, including from the AAML, so clearly respected and appreciated by the bar too. So much to get to, but first, of course, thank you so much for being here, Your Honor.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Hello to you and Samantha, and hi to everybody out there. It's good to see you. I know I can't really see you, but I can imagine. So I'm glad you're all there, and it's nice to be with you all.
Well, let's dive right in. I want you to kind of bring us into your courtroom out there in Pasadena and see what's going on these days. What are family law attorneys? What is the bar really doing well coming out of COVID? And kind of, in the courtroom as practitioners, what's going right? What's going really well these days?
Well, I'm prejudiced, Dan, because I've worked with family law attorneys for many, many years, and I kind of think they're the best. They're certainly amongst the most generous. We've been reconstructing our daily settlement officer program, still looking for more folks. And just the amount of time that the attorneys, both here in Pasadena and all over, donate is remarkable. And we're so appreciative of that, and so appreciative of the mindset that they have, which is they need to give back and to help because of the trauma of the pandemic, but also just our crushing load of cases that we have. So I'm very proud of the family law bars and their record of pitching in and rolling up their sleeves and helping.
Now, that's great. What can we be doing a little bit better? Where would you like to see improvement or just a different overall approach?
Well, of course, I think my name comes up on people's lips when they start talking about custody visitation matters. And I certainly have made it no secret and have spoken all across the state, really, and even across the country, on the fact that I believe that we will get better decisions for families when attorneys start assisting the court in making child-focused decisions when it comes to custody and visitation. I think that, and I know most, if not all of my colleagues believe this, that filling 10 pages with vilification of the other side doesn't really get us very far, and certainly doesn't help us figure out how to make things better for children. I think as soon as attorneys start realizing that helping their clients find child-focused resolutions is good advocacy. It's not bad advocacy. You're not selling your client down the drain by helping them find a more child-focused approach to whatever the problems are. So, I've been raising the call to this for a number of years, and I have any number of attorneys who I think have taken that approach, certainly in my courtroom, but I think we still have a ways to go with that.
There are so many tools that lawyers have in their toolbox, right? And judges have in their toolbox. We have minors counsel, we have custody evaluations, we have focused evaluations, reunification therapists, right? And there's a whole host of other people who are out there who potentially can help service families and really improve on them. Which of those resources do you think are the most effective for actually effectuating positive change in families? And I'm guessing there's a few, but help us.
Well, I think one of the major problems that we're all facing actually is a lack of these services. When I look back 20 years ago when I started, this is shocking to some people, but we had in family court services, for example, we had under contract 2 psychiatrists who could be brought into our cases, at least down at Mosque where I was for many years. All of that's disappeared. We had family court services doing full evaluations, low cost, full evaluations. All of those services have gone and have been cut. So I only wish we would be working as a community to reinstitute many of these services and expand our services. We have a dearth of custody evaluators. We have a shrinking body of minors counsel because the work is so difficult, and the people who take minors counsel cases are working basically at cost or less, and they get extremely difficult cases. And I think we have to come to terms with the fact that as a society, we just are not really coming to terms with the fact that we have an enormous mental health crisis that's going on, that's complicating our work enormously. When I started, albeit it's 20 years ago that I started on the bench, but I would say anecdotally that perhaps 20% of my cases had a mental health overlay. And I'm including addiction in this. Now, and I've run this by any number of my colleagues and they all agree, it's probably close to 70% of our cases have some form of mental health overlay. So as we've had this enormous rise in mental health consequences that are populating our cases, we've had a decline in services. Or we have services that are out of reach financially for so many of the litigants. And of course, the real sufferers are the children who are caught in the middle of all these things. So I think to answer your original question, all of those services are vital. It's important to have good minors counsel, thoughtful, dedicated minors counsel. It's great to have some form of therapeutic intervention that the court can rely on. But it's challenging to find those resources. And I'm fairly lucky because I work in a district that's economically on the higher end of things. I have attorneys, for example, in a much larger portion of my cases than many of my colleagues in the other districts or even in Moss.
So let's talk about minors council specifically for a moment. When do you want minors council involved, and what's the best way for minors council to participate in the case in a way that's actually going to reduce the conflict?
Well, firstly, I'll start by telling you when I don't want minors cases.
Okay, the inverse, that's fine too.
Which is basically when I say to myself, gee, this is a really hard decision. What do I do? I'm not appointing minors council for that. That's what I'm paid to do. And the decisions are difficult, perplexing, challenging, intimidating. But that's what I'm there to do, is to make those calls. So I don't pass on any of that decision-making to minors council. Minors council can argue their case. I think if there's any minors council that work for me out there, they'll be the first to tell you that sometimes I listen, sometimes I don't, depending on whether I agree with the kind of intervention that they're arguing for. But generally speaking, if my initial divide would be that if I find there are clinical issues, then I would look to some sort of therapeutic intervention or therapeutic evaluation. Whereas I think there's a factual problem and getting at the facts that would lead me to make a better decision, those are the cases I generally would look to appoint minors counsel. It's not a hard rule, but that's sort of the initial sort of breakdown of when I would go with therapeutic intervention rather than minors counsel.
You told a story to Dan about Steve Kolodny. It's a great story. Would you share that with the rest of us?
Sure. Steve Kolodny was a very powerful, interesting, enormously intelligent family law attorney for many, many, many years. And when I first took the bench, it was 2004, so I'm in Moss, and I'm on the bench, I don't know, maybe a month or so. And I'm doing my cases in the morning, and the courtroom door opens, and in walks Steve Kolodny, who I didn't know, but I knew who he was. And he came in, and he sat in the back row, and just sat there for an hour or so, watching me do my cases in the morning. And the next day, same thing. Just came in quietly, sat in the back row, watched whatever I was doing. And I was like, okay. And a couple of weeks later, popping up on my calendar, he had one of his big movie star clients, and he came in and stipulated to, and stayed with me. And he was there to watch, and over the years we became friends, and God rest him, we talked many times, but he was like, I needed to know the way you think. I needed to know how you approached your cases. I needed to know the kinds of judicial officer you were. And I wasn't going to hear that or read that off listserv. I needed to see it. So that's the kind of preparation that somebody like he brought to a case. And and so
I love that, because it does talk about the preparation and the humbleness of that approach. What other skills or pointers can you give younger attorneys who appeared before you? I think going in and watching is something that we've heard before, but what else would you want somebody to focus on who's starting out in practice?
Well, certainly preparation. I mean, that went for me when I was a family law trial lawyer, and right on up now, when people ask me, or colleagues, I train a lot of new judges. So they'll ask me, when something scary comes up, like I got a big trial or whatever, how do I deal with that anxiety? And I deal with it through preparation. The more prepared I am, I think the easier it is to get through the anxiety of whatever the case is. So for me, it's preparation, preparation, preparation. My family probably objects because I spend many hours stuck here in my office reading and thinking and rethinking. And in a difficult case, on the morning of the case, I often take stuff out again and reread it again to see if my thoughts or anything had changed about it. So that's what I would say to young attorneys, is to be prepared, and to know your case. You know, I'll have some attorneys come in here and I'll be like, well, what part of town does your client live in? I don't know. Or what's the name of your client's employer? I don't know, let me check. So I think that I can speak for most of my colleagues to say that's not going to give the court a lot of confidence in you if you don't have the basic details of your case. You know?
How about the technical skills, the writing, communicating with the bench, communicating with the staff? What's the best approach? What's your advice for attorneys that want to improve there?
Well, communicating with the staff, it always amazes me when, you know, my judicial assistant, whatever, will come in all upset because some attorney was just awful to her. And I'm like, when I was a lawyer, I can't even begin to tell you how nice we were to the JAs and everybody, because when we needed a favor, it was there. So I certainly would say be super nice to the court staff, because they'll help you. They'll be there for you. And so that's really an important thing.
So we obviously have a lot of different litigants in the courtroom, right? They're represented, there's unrepresented. How do you work with them parties differently, or is it different between people who have a lawyer standing there on their behalf and other people who are just standing there saying, I don't really know the system. How do you work your way through that with them?
Well, of course, the laws changed considerably since Elkins as to how we approach things. So, and it's a fine line, a finer line than when I started years ago, in that obviously we can't advocate for pro per litigants, but we do now have an obligation to give them the basic understanding of the process. So I try really hard to do that. Of course, the hardest cases, I think, for every judge are the cases where there's one attorney on one side and no attorney on the other. I think that's hard. It was hard for me as a lawyer, and it continues to be challenging as a judge, because you have to walk that line of not advocating for the unrepresented party, but again, fulfilling our obligation to make sure they have a basic understanding of, you know, of their rights and obligations and things such as that. So I can't say I have an easy answer for that. It's challenging to do. It's certainly a different approach when there are two lawyers there. Certainly a different approach.
So let's go back. We'll come back to the court and both the state of the courtroom and the state of the system. But I want to explore some of your personal history and see how this perspective, how this sense of empathy for the people who appear before you is developed. So tell us a little bit about, let's go all the way back. Tell us a little bit about your childhood. Any specific memories growing up in New York City?
All the way back to my childhood? Is that
all the way back?
Like to my distant birthday?
Yeah.
You mean back when Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and I all went to school together?
What was it like at the signing of the Declaration
of Independence? Yes. Well, I was born and raised in New York. I was born in New York City, Mount Sinai Hospital. And I lived in New York City till I was 10 years old. And then we moved out to the beach on Long Island. My dad was a corporate attorney, Fifth Avenue lawyer. My mom was a retired bookkeeper. She became a homemaker once myself, my brother and sister were born. And it was, I was very, very lucky, very, very lucky. I had terrific, supportive, interesting parents. And I was very, very lucky.
Were you a serious student in high school and college?
I was a good student, yes. I was a good student.
So what brought you out to Los Angeles?
Well, I went to college. I graduated from Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And I was going to be a writer. That was my goal. And my only problem was my family didn't have any connections in show business of any kind. And so a friend of a friend had one connection with a big talent agency. And I went to see this lady, and she was very nice. And she said, well, let me see if I can sort of secure a job for you. I was like, great. And so then she called me about a month later and she said, well, I have good news and bad news. I got you a job, but the job's with one of the studios in Los Angeles. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, I'm off to Los Angeles. So that's what really brought me out to Los Angeles, was that this first job, just an entry-level job at a studio. And I did that for a while. And that's what brought me to Los Angeles. I had otherwise no connection. I didn't know anybody in Los Angeles. I just, packed my little car and out I came.
How did you support yourself while you were waiting for the bigger break?
Well, at first, like I said, I was doing some just, entry-level sort of menial work at a studio. And then I felt that I needed to have more time to develop a resume of material. Not that I knew anybody that I could show it to, but I sensed that. And so I waited tables, I rented cars. Here I was with my fancy sort of little Ivy degree and waiting tables and renting cars. But I must say, my parents, God rest them, they just 100% supportive of me. And so that's, that's what I did. And, until
Do you still write?
Well, the big break happened.
Do you still write?
Yes. I'm writing actually a 20-page statement of decision, which is, but yes, you want to hear the story about how I broke into show business? Is that?
Yeah, of course. Well, it's either that or we all sing the Charles in Charge theme song together. So let's save the audience that. Why don't we hear your story?
So this is an absolutely true story. But I was like, I'd been out here 2-3 years. I was at the advanced age of like 24. And I was completely downtrodden that I wasn't a big famous star as of yet. So I called my dad's office, probably to bellyache and complain. And his longtime secretary, Florence, who'd known me since I was a little kid, she answered the phone. She goes, well, how are you doing out there? I said, well, I'm doing fine, Florence. Everything's good. Don't worry about it. And she said to me, I have a cousin who I've never met, but my cousin had something to do with the show called Maude that had Beatrice Arthur in it. And she's like, take his name down. I'm like, all right, Florence, fine. I took his name and number, thank you, put my dad on. And then about a month later, when I was like, I can't believe I'm not famous yet. I'm 24. And I came across this little note with his name. And I guess I was desperate enough at that point in time, at the age of 24, that I just picked up the phone and I just dialed. And some guy answered, and I was like, oh gosh, this is painful. I said, but hi, you don't know me, and you have this cousin in New York who you don't know. But in any event, I'm a young writer, and blah, blah, and he cut me off. He goes, listen, he goes, I'm really busy with something right now. I can't talk to you, but call me next week. Clunk. I said, okay. He did say call him back next week. So I did. I waited a week and I called him back. And he said, this time he said to me, well, I'm doing this new pilot with this actor, George Kennedy, and I'm under a deadline, but call me back next week. I said, okay, give me a little bit more information. And so I called him the following week. And this time he talk to me. And I said I was a writer, I wanted to be a writer, and we talked for a little bit. And after about 5-10 minutes, I could see the conversation was ending. And something in me said, I can't let the conversation end. But it just was going. And before I knew it, he was saying, well, goodbye. And he hung up. And that thing in you that somehow just compels you to do things, I just picked the phone right back up because I knew I just couldn't end the phone call without getting something that I needed. And I called him back. And luckily, as soon as he heard my voice, he laughed. And I was like, thank goodness. And he said to me, okay. He goes, listen, do you have some material for me to read? I said, yes. And he said, okay. He goes, come by, drop it off at the studio. He goes, I promise you I will read it. But if you don't hear from me, then please don't call again. I said, okay. So I got, the next day, it was like Friday, and I got all dressed up and I went down to the studio. And the secretary was like, give it to me. Thank you. Goodbye. And out I went. And then that night, Friday night, I was about 9:30 at night. I was walking out my apartment with some friends for a night on the town. And I heard the phone ring. And my friends were like, let the answering machine pick it up. We had answering machines in those days. And something told me to go back in there. And I walked back in. And it was him. And he said, I read your material. I thought it's terrific. Let's have lunch next week. And a year later, he was doing a new series with Beatrice Arthur. And he hired me for my first writing job.
That's amazing. That persistence. Was that a happy time in your life, both scrapping to make it and then ultimately landing and being a staff writer on some of these shows?
Oh, totally. I mean, it was happier after I got the first job.
What else was going on in the 80s? So that was the mid to late 1980s. What else was going on? What was it like in Los Angeles for you then?
Well, it was great for me. I mean, I was living the life. I did, a number of different shows. And I just, I bought my first place. It was fancy. My best friend was a guy named Ron Palillo, who was on Welcome Back, Kotter. I was living the dream. I was living the life as a television writer, and I just could not have even conceived that I would have any other life than that. I was still in my early to mid 20s and with more success than I could have imagined, and doing what I really always wanted to do and always saw myself doing. So I couldn't have imagined that I would have a different life than that. But again, fate and the world doesn't always fall in line with how you expect your life to go.
So at that point, you have this pivot in your life. What is going on in the 1980s in Los Angeles, and how did you realize you were going to make a change in your career trajectory?
Well, I'll tell you, I remember in maybe 1983 or so, a good friend of mine who was a physician at the VA hospital. And I had dinner with him. We were walking down the street in West Hollywood, and he said to me, he goes, you cannot imagine what is about to happen to the world, because they were seeing this strange kind of infection that started to spread, and they saw it at the VA hospital early on. And boy, he was not kidding, because shortly thereafter, 84 or so, people I knew started to get really, really sick with strange illnesses. And shortly after that, those people started to die, and people I knew personally started to get sick. And at first, of course, there wasn't even a name for it, but of course the name became AIDS. And so I worked long hours at the studio on my shows and stuff, but I volunteered, I delivered meals, I did various volunteer work to try to help and to try to pitch in. But it kept getting worse and worse. And so it was in 1987. So 4 years or so after I started my writing career. 1987, I was at the weekend after Thanksgiving in 1987. I was sitting at a funeral, one of two I would attend that day. And I was calculating, and that was the 60th funeral that I had attended in 1987. And none of the people that passed away were over the age of 50. This was 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I just remember sitting there saying, I just, firstly, I feel like I need to do something to help fight back, because we all felt so helpless. There was no support from the government, little, if any, from the community, no medications to stop this. It was a death sentence. And you feel so helpless. So I felt the need that I needed to do something. And also it was very hard, after you spend the weekend attending funerals and watching people get sicker and sicker, it became really hard for me to be funny come Monday morning.
So what you started thinking about making a change, what was on the table at that time?
Well, first I thought, well, maybe I'll go back to medical school and be a doctor, but I'm probably not too well suited to be a doctor. I'm a little too squeamish, I think, for different things. And so, of course, my dad was a lawyer, and so I was comfortable around the legal community. And so I ended up saying, okay, I got this sort of pot of money that I've earned and a nice place to live. What can I invest it in? I'll invest it in me. And I went to USC Law School, and where I became sort of an activist for different causes. But then after graduating law school, I became the first staff attorney hired at AIDS Project Los Angeles.
What did your agent say when you walked away?
When I told my agent I was leaving, he said, oh, yeah. He goes, I'll give you 6 months and then you'll be back. And that's what, 35 years ago? So he was wrong on that. When I found a life that was really dedicated to helping other people, somehow or other that became more meaningful to me than just making them laugh. So I just stayed.
While at USC, how did you talked about you became this activist at USC? How did your activism evolve over time? You were very committed to the AIDS
right.
epidemic.
Right, and I was already working through law school at AIDS Project Los Angeles. So I went to law school, but I worked as an extern for them. But I really got involved accidentally. So often we stumble upon our lives. We don't really go out and choose them. We find them after we stumble upon our life. But what happened was that at USC, they had a non-discrimination policy for all academic programs. And amongst the non-discrimination groups were gay and lesbian groups. You couldn't discriminate against them in academic programs. And so the school got a Supreme Court justice named Byron White to judge our moot court program. Now, we checked into this, and moot court wasn't just a guest visitor, it was an academic program, so it fell under the non-discrimination policy. And Justice White had written the majority opinion in the Bowers versus Hardwick decision, which criminalized gay intimacy.
We distributed that to the group this morning. It's crazy to think that that was actually written.
Yeah. So we filed, when I say we, the gay and lesbian group on campus, of which I was one of the officers at that point. And we filed an objection to the Supreme Court justice appearing in the academic program. And well, little did I know that all hell would break loose with that little maneuver.
So,
not only from the powerful alumni who of course wanted a Supreme Court justice to come, and the faculty, but all sorts of outside groups ended up getting involved and with protests and actions. And so anyway, I found myself in the middle of that, and I ultimately helped in brokering a sort of compromise deal. But through that, I became an activist, I guess, in that sense, in involving myself in that.
And there was resolve. You were an instrumental in how that all evolved, right? So can you tell us the end of that story?
Yeah. So it was going to be difficult to get them to disinvite the Supreme Court justice for obvious reasons. And to file lawsuits against them would have taken a long time to play out. So we got them to, there was another judge, Justice Norris, who just passed away a couple of years ago. And he had written some very, very pro-LGBT decisions from the federal bench. And so we arranged to have him replace one of the other members on the moot court panel. And not only did Justice Norris do that, he came and he had lunch with all the LGBT students. And we also, which is I think the biggest victory of all, was that, and remember, this is the, 1989, 1990, it's not like now. And we were able to have the entire student population talking about it and thinking about it. And to me, that was always the biggest victory of all. But in any event, Judge Norris was terrific, and he was on the panel to sort of balance the issues. And he promised us and then reported back to us that he'd had a long discussion with Justice White on the issue. And we also, there were threats from the school that if there were any kinds of disruptions, they would expel students. So we negotiated what they could do and what they couldn't do. So for example, they all wore, many people wore Bowers buttons with a slash through it. And that was allowed because it was silent. There were students who stood up and held up banners in protest, but they were silent, and that was deemed okay. So we were able to protect fellow students who were protesting. And then I spoke a lot to outside groups who had threatened to come and picket, ACT UP and other groups, and got them to sort of back off and let the student protests handle it. So it was very complicated and very involved. Little did I know my mediative powers would come to use so many years later on the family law bench.
So I want to take you back to your time with APLA for a second. What was the type of work that you were doing during that period of your life?
I'll share it. I have to tell you that, I still feel the trauma of my years there. It was unbelievably difficult work. Firstly, just as a first step, all my clients died unrelentingly. So it was difficult in that sense. And dealing with people with end-of-life issues was very difficult. The people who were sick were social pariahs and outcasts, abandoned by their government, abandoned by their fellow human beings. Family members were angry and disruptive about the lifestyles and orientations that their family members had commenced on. So it was difficult in every sense of the word. And it was dangerous. I shared with Dan that on occasion I had to get dressed in a sort of a hazmat suit and go into virulent tubercular wards and deliver end-of-life services to people with HIV. And I can't stress to people who don't recall this age and time, but it's not only that people died horrifically. They were human skeletons, pockmarked by horrible skin cancers. They got all sorts of diseases that physicians only saw in animals beforehand, that they'd never treated. People went blind routinely from megalovirus in the eyes. It was extremely difficult work. And as I said, I still feel the trauma of those years.
How did you deal with the trauma then?
You know, I kept reminding myself that I'm fighting back. As I said to you beforehand, when I decided to make a change in my life, it was because I felt so helpless beforehand. This was all just happening to me. Whereas when I was doing this work, at very least, I was fighting back somehow. And we did some really important stuff. For example, I mean, it was through the advocacy work that we did with the state government that we developed hospital visitation authorizations. This may come as a shock to people, but until then, who the hospital allowed in or didn't allow in was, unless you were married, was based on family members. So we would have families coming from religiously conservative backgrounds who came out because their child or cousin or whatever was in the AIDS ward, and their significant other, who they'd been with for years, was barred from going in and being with them. And then they would go to the apartment, and because the significant other's name wasn't on the lease, they would take everything. And this didn't happen occasionally, this happened all the time. And so we were able to get legislation passed and develop the hospital authorization program. And so when we worked with our clients before they ever got to the hospital, we said, if you're hospitalized, who do you want to come in and see you? My significant other, okay? And who do you want to keep out of there? My religious grandma, you know, Rebecca, who I don't want there. And so we were able to do work like that. And I don't know, Dan, it felt like I was at least doing something to fight back.
When did you know it was the right time to move on? Was it the accumulation of the trauma, or did something change as the crisis changed?
Well, in 96 or 97, everything changed because of the protease inhibitors. I left somewhat before that, really because the illness and death had entered my inner circle of family and friends. And so it was time for me to leave and take a break.
So you go to a civil law firm at that point, is that right? And what drew you there?
You know, I had done a lot of advocacy work and a lot of other kind of legal work, but I have any courtroom experience. And I thought I could gain some courtroom experience. And so some guy who was a volunteer attorney at AIDS Project Los Angeles said, come work with us. And I said, okay. And so I did. And shortly thereafter, the firm merged with a firm that had a family law department. And I said, okay. And about a month or so later, the lady partner called, she wanted to have lunch with me. And I was like, oh, here it is, I'm getting fired. You know, and I went and she said, we want you to come do family law with us. And I said, wait a minute. I said, I don't know anything about family law. I said, I didn't even take community property in law school. I don't know anything. And she said to me, don't worry about that. You'll learn that you have the right temperament for the work. I said, okay. And I went in the following week. My first family law file was sitting on my desk. And I opened it up and read it. And I was like, yep, this is it. I just knew right away. I knew right away. I mean, what's more interesting than the human condition?
So at some point, you end up back in the courthouse, not just practicing family law, but you end up doing some work with the domestic violence courthouse clinic at San Fernando Valley Courthouse. Is that right?
Yeah, I had, remember, I started off with my public interest roots for public interest law. at APLA and stuff. And then I practiced with my family law firm, which it was invaluable to me, invaluable to me. The partners were so generous to me and taught me so much about family law and about litigating. But my heart ultimately was in public interest work. And so there was an opening for the head of the family law domestic violence program at the San Fernando Valley's legal aid office. And so I applied and I left to go do public interest work. And, you know, and
What was it like teaching at the same time?
teaching at the same time was challenging because of time restrictions, but I taught family law. I ended up teaching family law in my last years in public interest work, and also after I took the bench and continued to teach family law at USC Law School. And I still get a kick. I don't know if any of them are out there today, but I have my former students that appear in front of me, and I get a real charge out of that. So
What did you want your students, and we talked about this a little before, but what were you trying to teach them most? What did you want them to really take away from your classes?
what do I want my students to take away? Well, certainly I try to provide as firm a base of understanding of the law as possible for my students. That's the first thing. And again, when it comes to the custody and visitation matters, well, I often talk to them about this sort of constant dichotomy in family law, where all the due process rights are given to the parents, but of course the law is best interest of the children, which I think constantly creates a strange dynamic in the courtroom. And I talk a lot with my students about that and about their obligations to making decisions in a child-focused manner.
So at some point you go from activist, lawyer, teacher, and you decide to take the bench. Why did you decide to make that change?
You know, again, this is another thing where I stumble upon my future. I don't seem to ever really choose it that clearly. But I was head of the domestic violence family law program at the legal aid office out in the San Fernando Valley. And one of the projects that we were working on was opening a domestic violence clinic in the San Fernando courthouse. And so I worked on that project. The supervising judge out there was Judge McLaughlin. And we worked on this project together, and we did open a courthouse-based domestic violence clinic that provided free services for people who wanted to file for restraining orders. And when after the facility opened, Judge McLaughlin said, "Let's go out to lunch." I said, "Okay." And we went out to lunch and we sat down, and the first thing he said to me was, "Well, when are you going to apply to take the bench?" And I was like, "The bench? That's for the old guys and girls." You know, I was like, whoa. I said, "Well," I said, "I'll think about it." And I sort of let it go for a while. And then I guess about a year or so later, the commissioners list, the commissioners were replenishing the list, and they opened up applications for commissioners. And a colleague of mine said, "You should apply for this." And I was like, "Me? Why?" And she said, "Because you have big firm experience, public interest experience, and teaching at a major law school. There are a lot of people that have one, maybe even two of those things, but you have all three of those things." And I thought about it, and I hemmed and hawed. You know, I was a single parent in those days, and so I thought about the time commitments, how it would impact my son and stuff, but ultimately I applied. And for those of you who don't know the process, you sort of go through a series of interviews, first with two judges, and then if you make it on with a large panel of judges. And so I went for my first interview, and I walked in for it, and the new presiding judge from Los Angeles County was my interviewer. And lo and behold, it was Judge McLaughlin. just by chance. And so I went through that process, and I was at the top of the top 2 or 3 on the commissioner's list. And shortly thereafter, I was elected, and I sat in mosque in family law, which I did for 8 years.
How did it feel that first time, that first day on the bench, wearing the robe, having the parties and lawyers in front of you? I bet it was very exciting.
It was exciting. It was exciting. The most exciting thing, of course, was the day I got sworn in. I mean, I think that was the happiest day of my dad's life ever. So that was a really terrific thing for me. And I felt I was very lucky because, unlike so many of my colleagues who were placed in an assignment they know nothing about, I was placed in a family law assignment. And so I felt totally at home. I knew the law, I knew the culture, I knew so many of the lawyers. So I was very, very lucky in that sense, that I felt immediately at home. My biggest responsibility, and I still feel it today, 20 years later, is that old advocate in me. I have to make sure that that old advocate is kept aside. And I remind myself all the time that I'm the neutral, I'm not the advocate. And so I think that's was challenging for me in the beginning. And it's something that I always have had to keep a guard against.
Did your perspective change after your first open election, after your first race to be an elected judge to the bench, when you were accused of some campaign violations and stood trial? How did that change your perspective? And acquitted, of course. How did that change your perspective on the process, or just being on the bench generally?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, that was a harbinger, and we see all the time the challenges to election code violations now. We see them all the time. The only takeaway I have from it is that it really reassured me in our system. As we've seen recently, our legal system is able to handle all the accusations and allegations of election code violations. And so it happened with me. It was quickly dispensed of. I was completely vindicated, and I came away, my takeaway was just, our system works. Can our system of jurisprudence get better? Well, certainly it can get better. Does it work equally for people with resources as opposed to people without resources? Probably not. But overall, it gave me a lot of confidence in our system, which I still have to this day. So it really, really helped me in that sense. And that's the only thing I take away from that experience.
So now you're in a position where you do a lot of the training for new judges, different than students, but kind of the same in some ways. What do you want to emphasize to new bench officers, especially in family law?
Well, there's so many things that I want to talk to them about, but I think the hardest thing for people who are not involved in family law, who take the bench, is that they look for all the answers in the family code. And family law is very unique in the sense that we as bench officers have an enormous amount of discretion. And so the answers to a lot of the problems, especially with custody and visitation, the answers are not always there. The answers are in how you think about the case and where you focus your attentions. And getting lawyers who are linear thinkers, who are very reliant on what does that statute say, to try to help new judicial officers get comfortable with the amount of discretion that the law gives us as family law judges. I think some people think, well, it's easy, you have so much discretion. But in fact, having that much discretion is actually much harder, because there are no easy answers with a lot of our cases.
knowing that and how hard it is in these very difficult decisions the family law bench is asked to make, how would you go about recruiting and retaining family law judges, some with experience, preferably in family law, and some without?
Well, I certainly have been an advocate of the fact that we need more family law attorneys to apply for the bench. A lot feel, well, I don't want to raise money for an election, and I don't want to, I don't have political connections. And so I've tried to encourage, and I have encouraged a number of them to apply for the commissioner's list. Because I think it's really, really important. Not to say that we don't have a number of terrific bench officers who came to family law only after they took the bench. We certainly do have some. But I think to pepper the family law department as a whole with a number of bench officers who have experienced the culture of family law for many, many years, I think it can only help the department as a whole. So that's really what I've tried to do is encourage family law attorneys to apply. I've been a little successful, but most of them say, I don't want to work that hard. It's really long hours and it's really hard decisions. I can't tell you how many attorneys come to me and say, I don't know how you do it, case after case after case. So it's a hard job. It's a hard job, but I try my best to encourage as many younger lawyers to apply.
So let's talk a little bit more about the court. We've touched on it. If you had a magic wand, and within reality, you're never going to get the unlimited budget. You're never going to get 30 new courtrooms, at least in this environment. What would you want to prioritize? What do you think the bar should be arguing for as a group and advocating for in terms of resourcing the court?
Without a doubt, mental health service, mental health advocacy, without a doubt. When unrepresented, even represented litigants come to me and they're dealing with a schizophrenic teenager, we need some experts. The issues of addiction, what do? You have a parent who's alcoholic. You have a parent who's using. Does that mean they automatically lose their child? Or more importantly, how you look at it, does that automatically mean the child loses their parent? And so I would focus, if it was up to me, I would advocate for a larger budget to develop some form of mental health services that people can gain entry to. I think it's just vital to do that. And so often people are coming to the family law bench because they have no place else to turn to. Our public resources have been worn thin. And so that's where I would focus it. And where that falls, whether it's getting outside resources, contracting for people, expanding family court services, all of that is up for debate. But I think until we come to terms with the fact that we have a mental health crisis, and in all aspects of our courts, in our criminal courts, in our family courts, in our dependency courts, and until we as a society say, wait a minute, these are our children, these are our young adults, until we come to terms with that and help them, then I think we are not stepping up and stepping forward the way we need to. I can't tell you how many litigants I have who are homeless. I have no trouble believing the numbers of the homeless population because they're my litigants. So that's what I would focus on, is figuring out how better to deal with the mental health crisis.
We've touched on how you're not afraid to make the hard choices, how you are not just a rubber stamp to custody evaluators and minors counsel, how you want to put kids first, and how lawyers need to be better at advocating for their clients by advocating for their children. what is your legacy, or what do you want your legacy to be in the family law community?
Well, I do that, but you know, I just want to say that, for example, when you get a stipulation by parents for a custody arrangement for a 1-year-old child where it's 6 months with one parent, 6 months with the other, it's not hard not to sign on to that. You know, I mean, parents treat their children as if they're another piece of property and they're seeing to their needs. And so I do those things. I do read all the stipulations because it's horrifying to me what people will agree to, what parents will agree to. And as I tell most of them, they may be loving parents. I'm sure they're loving parents. They're not always the best of parents. And my legacy, you know, I run a very active and always have a very active student extern program. I always have numerous students, and those students that I taught at law school, they're really my legacy, as far as I'm concerned. The young people who I've taught and hopefully impressed child-focused decision-making on them. And to see my legal externs from 10, 12, 14 years ago now be partners in big family law firms, that gives me a good feeling.
I love that. And we won't ask you what the future holds in 2026 or beyond, but I really think that everything you talked about today is going to leave a lasting mark, hopefully, not just through your externs and in the different litigants and practitioners that have appeared before you, but in the broader community. So thank you, Judge Silberman.
Thank you.
This was great. That wraps up today's episode. Please mark your calendars now and join us for our next episodes, all at 12:30 p.m., usually on the first Wednesday of each month. In September, we'll have David Glass, and then Dennis and Laura Wasser, Roz Zuckerman, Bruce and Keith Clemens, Judge Shelly Kaufman, Michael Trobe, Kimia Klein, Adam Lipsick, and more into next year. Thank you to Genna, Lynn, Leslie, Jose, and Belinda at the bar, the Family Law Executive Committee led by Aaron Gray and Chelsea Stephen, and of course, all of our section sponsors. Most importantly, again, thank you, Judge Silberman, for being here and sharing so much with us.
My pleasure.
You.